So I have a joint lever question and I'm going to give away some free stuff. Good morning. Happy Friday. I have Neuro Coffee in hand and it is perfect. Man, hadn't had this in a week. Truly missed it. That's a good batch, Dr. Mike. Way to go. So Friday, just got back from vacation. Need a massive catch-up day. You know, the one drawback from going on vacation is this accumulation of stuff while you're gone. So the Q&A email box is full, and we'll get to those things as we can over the next week or so. But I do have some housekeeping stuff, and then we'll get to a joint lever question here in just a second. While I was on vacation, I thought, well, how's another way that we could take this transaction thing off the table and help some more people? And so here's what we're going to do. So pay attention. I'm going to do a series of free 15-minute consultations. So here's what you're going to have to do. You got to go to the askbillhartman@gmail.com email, askbillhartman@gmail.com. In the subject line, put free 15-minute consultation request. If you put anything else in it in the subject line, I will delete it. Free 15-minute consultation request. So here's how it's going to work. You get to ask me anything that you want in that 15 minutes. We're going to record the whole thing on Zoom because chances are if you've got a specific question, someone else does too. And so we'll be able to help other people with this. At the end of the week or so, when we get around to the Coffee and Coaches Conference call on Thursday mornings, I'm going to have those fine folks do a little bit of voting, and they'll vote on the best question of the week. And if you get picked as the best question person, here you go. You get the t-shirt, hoodie, and one of those. You get a hat too. So a little incentive. I don't know how big an incentive that is. For some, maybe a lot. For some, maybe very little. Doesn't really matter to me. This is what we're going to do. So like I said, we'll be able to help a lot of other people, and we'll be able to get your questions answered as well. So again, one more time, subject line, free 15-minute consultation request at askbillhartman@gmail.com. Okay, so let's dig into a little bit of a Q&A question to wrap up the week for you guys leading into a great weekend. And this comes from Patrick. And Patrick says, hi, Bill. Hi, Patrick. He goes, is looking at joint levers is looking at joints as levers totally useless? And I would say, Patrick, that I don't look at joints as levers for various reasons that we'll get into, but there may be some use in some of this two-dimensional representation that we typically use via Euclidean geometry. So they break things into the imaginary planes and they try to calculate forces, and they look at joints as levers. And there may be some good reasoning for that, because what it does allow us to do is potentially identify where we might be seeing loads or stressors being applied in certain aspects of movement, which might be helpful to determine, causation of damage, pain, injuries, however we want to look at this thing. But from the reality standpoint, the reason that I don't like to look at joints as levers is because we need one specific thing for a lever system, and that is a fulcrum. So to quote Archimedes, it's like, give me a lever long enough and a fulcrum on which to place it, and I shall move the world. So without the fulcrum, you don't really have a good lever system. The problem with the fulcrum in a joint is that we have friction and we have heat. And both of those are going to be destructive to the hyaline cartilage at the ends of the bones. As durable as it may seem, it is still delicate in regards to its ability to wear away. The other aspect of it that we haven't talked about, I don't think, before, is that this friction would actually slow down joint movement, which would make movement very, very difficult. So if we think about normal walking, the hip joint's going to move at about 200 degrees per second. If we look at throwing a baseball, it's about 7,000 to 9,000 degrees per second. And so if you want to get an idea how fast that is, swing your arm around in a circle 20 times in 1 second, and that's how fast a Major League Baseball pitcher's arm is moving. And so if we did have levers, joint levers, and we did have fulcrums, and we did have that friction, I don't think we'd be able to produce these movements, and they would be incredibly destructive all at the same time. So rather than me digging deeper into this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut away. We're going to go to a video that I did previously where I was talking about why bones don't touch and why the joints aren't levers, because I think it'd be a good video for you to reference, Patrick. So for the rest of you, Have a great weekend. Have a terrific Friday. I will see you guys next week. We'll be digging into some Q&As, and hopefully we'll get a few of these free 15-minute Zoom calls scheduled over the weekend, and we'll present some of those for you next week. Everybody have a great weekend. I'll see you later. But we're going to cover a lot of the mechanical aspects that I think are in play and are important to me in regard to how I perceive these things through my model. First things first, Johnny, we're going to invert your problem a little bit, and we're going to say, why is it bad if bones touch? So the bones touching thing probably comes from using dead guy anatomy as a model. So dead guys actually do have levers. And so to have a lever, you have to have a fulcrum. And so the bones touch on dead guys because they're dry. And so they look like levers. And so then in school, they teach you that, oh, your joints move just like levers. The reality is, in a living, breathing human, and the fact that we're full of water and we've got synovial fluid in our joints, we don't have fulcrums. If we had a fulcrum, there would be a lot of pressure and heat that would be released every time we moved, and we would destroy our joints in no time. And so we don't want fulcrums in our joints. In fact, if you do have a fulcrum in your joint, you're probably talking to the orthopedic surgeon right now. So now what we have to understand is that we have to have mechanisms that keep these bones from touching. So let's break these down. Now, let's start with structure. So your 99% water, 1% stuff, your 1% stuff is almost all the same, and it's all viscoelastic tissue. And so I have a representation of viscoelastic tissues in my silly putty. And so this is viscoelastic, so it's going to behave very similarly. And so viscoelastic tissue will behave differently depending on the forces that are applied. So if I stretch this gently, I get this nice elongation of my silly putty, but if I pull it really hard and fast, it snaps off clean. So what that means is the tissue behavior changes based on the forces that are applied. And so when I apply a high rate of force, I get very, very stiff viscoelastic tissue. So this is the overcoming action that I always talk about when we're talking about concentric overcoming or eccentric overcoming behaviors. So I have an increased stiffness of tissue. So if I had an orientation of fibers as such that if I loaded them at a higher rate, I can make them really, really stiff. And so we actually have that. So when we look at the fascia that surrounds everything, so we talk about the periosteum, we talk about the fascia that surrounds all of the ligamentous structure and all the structures around the knee. So the knee is very busy when you look at it from a connective tissue standpoint. And so what happens is when we load that joint, those viscoelastic tissues behave very, very similar to my silly putty. They get very, very stiff, and they create this rigidity around the knee, and that actually pushes the bones apart. So now we have a mechanical protective mechanism that helps us keep those bones apart. So that's very, very useful. Now, it's a little counterintuitive too, by the way. When you think about it, it's like you think these are like tension elements and stretchy stuff, they become very, very stiff. So keep that in mind. Now, let's go to inside the knee joint. So the knee is filled with water, basically. It's synovial fluid, so it's water with some protein stuff that floats around. Well, water is this really, really unique substance that is cooler than you can imagine. And so water behaves differently, just like our viscoelastic tissues behave differently under different forces. Water behaves differently depending on what substance it's next to. And so we have hyaline cartilage that lines the joint. If we talk about the knee, so at the end of the femur we have hyaline cartilage, on the tibia we have hyaline cartilage. And so when the water's right next to it, it promotes the separation of the water into positively and negatively charged water. So the negative charged water is right along the hyaline cartilage on both sides, and then the positively charged water is going right through the middle of the knee. So if you took the north end of two magnets and try to push them together, you can feel the repulsion between the two magnets. So this positively charged water is constantly trying to push its positive charges apart. And so now we've got this electromagnetic force that is now pushing the knee apart. So now we have an electromagnetic effect to create this separation. And so there's a cool study from 1980 from Teriyama. It's Japanese. And they took fresh cadaver knees with intact synovial joints, and they applied downward pressure through the joint, about 220 pounds into the knee joint, and they compressed, and then it hit sort of like a maximum position, but the bones didn't touch. So they got really, really close together, but they did not touch. And so right away, even in a joint that's not living but it's intact, and we have all the structures available to us, it still behaves similarly. So it keeps the bones apart. So again, very, very strong electromagnetic effect. How do we know? Well, in the same study, they took a hip joint that had arthritis. So on the weight-bearing surface, there was no cartilage. They did the same compressive test, and they got the subchondral bones to touch because there was no cartilage in the way to create this electromagnetic effect and keep the joints apart. So kind of a big deal. Now, synovial fluid has little protein things that are floating around. Proteins are negatively charged, and they would attract positive charges, just like two magnets. So you take the north end of one magnet, the south end, and they snap right together. And so we have these proteins that are surrounded by positive charge. We get more positive charges, and so now the synovial fluid itself helps us create that middle positively charged area that keeps the joints apart. So if, for those of you that have had arthritic changes and some wonkiness in your knees, if you will, that have had the Synvisc injections, what they're doing is they're injecting you with water that has protein in it, and it helps restore some of that mechanism, which is why you might feel better for a little while until the effect is no longer intact. So we have structure, we have mechanics, we have electromagnetic forces that keep the bones apart. So if they keep the bones apart, how on earth do we get arthritic changes? So now we got to look at the synovial joint a little bit closer. So when we look at the structure of the synovial joint, on either end, as long as we maintain our hyaline cartilage intact, it appears that we can keep our bones apart. So we have to look at what affects that hyaline cartilage, and we say, oh, pressure, tension, blah, 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 blah. But the reality is hyaline cartilage gets its nutrition from the bony side. So you'll see the little arteries that I drew on my picture here, and that blood supply is what gives the nutrition to the cartilage. So it diffuses from the bloodstream towards the hyaline cartilage on the bony side. Well, if I put enough pressure and tension on those bones, those trabeculae will compress. If the trabeculae at the ends of the bone compress enough, I restrict the blood flow to the ends of the joint. Now, these trabeculae can also fracture. So, you played 15 years in the NBA, you're probably going to get some fracturing of those trabeculae. They're kind of like shock absorbers. If you've ever driven on the interstate and you see the trash barrels right below the abutment of the overpass, and what those are is they're trash barrels filled with water. So if you drive off the road and you hit them, it'll slow you down so you don't slam right into the bridge. Trabeculae kind of the same way. They're kind of like shock absorbers. So they're filled with space and water, and so when you land, they compress, but they can fracture over time, and then you compress, and then the subchondral bone actually gets denser. And so you'll see this in arthritic research. Well, they'll see the precipitating changes of the subchondral bone gets denser and denser and denser. Well, that's going to reduce our blood flow to the cartilage. The cartilage will slowly wear away, and it gets thinner and thinner and thinner. So now we're losing our electromagnetic effect. So now we can't keep the joint farther and farther apart. And so now we do get compressive strategies that will actually become destructive. And so again, on that end, that's pretty much how I see a lot of these arthritic changes occurring, because it's a pressure related phenomenon, it's a blood flow related phenomenon, it's a nutrition to the cartilage. By the way, discs do the same thing. Okay, don't tell anybody. Now, how do we get medial compartment versus lateral compartment? So now we got to think about our propulsive strategies. So our propulsive strategies are what we apply into the ground. And so propulsion in and of itself is biased towards internal rotation. So we have to apply pressure into the ground. So remember, when we evolved, we were externally rotated, we were swimmers, we came up on land, we had to learn how to internally rotate and press into the ground. And so Johnny, when we talk about the internal rotation, I got to internally rotate my femur, right? Because I got to drive down into the ground through internal rotation. So more often than not, I'm going to be applying a little bit more force towards that medial compartment as I internally rotate the femur to push into the ground. And so, if we talk about the pressure mechanism that we just talked about in regard to the arthritis, that's why we would probably see the bias towards more medial compartment problems than lateral compartment problems, because we're applying forces into the ground. We have to, just because of